Republicans may be falling in line. Welcome to Columbus on the Record. With 3 weeks to go in Ohio's election month, some notable trends are starting to develop. First, in the tight U.S. Senate race between Democrat Tim Ryan and Republican J.D. Vance, two polls released this week show little daylight between the candidates. A USA Today Network Suffolk University poll shows Vance with a 2-point lead. That is within that poll's margin of error. A few days later, another poll showed a bit of a gap opening up between the two candidates. The poll done by the firm Signal shows Vance with a 4-point lead. That is just outside the margin of error. With the race so tight, many tuned in to the second and final debate between the two men. It was more spirited and more personal than the first one. J.D. Vance tied Tim Ryan to Nancy Pelosi. Ryan tied Vance to extremists who believe Democrats encourage immigration of people of color to replace white people.
This great replacement theory was the motivator for the shooting in Buffalo, yes, where that shooter had all these great replacement theory writings that J.D. Vance agrees with. Some sicko got this information that he's peddling with, again, those extremists that he runs around with, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ted Cruz, all these guys, they just want to stoke this racial violence. We're tired of it, JD.
This is disgusting.
I'd like to get
here's exactly what happens when the media and people like Tim Ryan accuse me of engaging the great replacement theory. I'll tell you exactly what happens, Tim. What happens is that my own children, my biracial children, get attacked by scumbags online and in person because you are so desperate for political power that you'll accuse me, the father of 3 beautiful biracial babies, of engaging in racism. We are sick of it.
Andrew Tobias, pretty heated moment in that debate. Can you tell from the polls if these debates are having any impact on this race?
I don't really think of debates that way unless a candidate makes a colossal error that just, breaks through and makes them look bad with all voters. Really, I think it's more about clips that candidates are trying to create. And so the one we watched right there is probably something that J.D. Vance, actually I know, he and his allies are pushing that on social media. And then Tim Ryan had his own kind of like zingers and exchanges that he had in itself. So it's much more like atomized, I guess, than sort of the debate itself. But I think it does potentially give them opportunity to raise money. Maybe if people are watching that in the Youngstown area, they may have had a certain opinion about it. But I think that, tends to be sort of limited.
Mark Weaver, I look at Republicans after that bitter primary, and they were skeptical of J.D. Vance, skeptical of, is he really supportive of Donald Trump? And the establishment Republicans, is he too far in the Trump camp? I think the debates perhaps helped him sort of put those fears aside.
We always see this when there's a contentious primary. Tim Ryan had a primary, it wasn't particularly contentious. And of course, we know J.D. Vance had that. So he's had to rebuild his image over the summer and early fall. I think he's done that. This race should revert back to Ohio's default, which is 6, 8, 10 points to the right, which means he's likely to win.
Jesse Balmer, this was in Youngstown, Mahoning Valley. That was the target audience for this. I don't know what the ratings were like, but did it have any impact up there, do you believe?
I mean, this is an area that would be good for J.D. Vance to be able to solidify. It's an area that is trending Republican, that has been going in that direction. It's an area that Tim Ryan has represented at various points over the years, and this should be like a nice home base for him. But part of the reason why he's looking at U.S. Senate is, the trends in his own representative area are becoming less and less favorable for Democrats.
Herb, I was surprised this debate didn't focus more on economic issues. There are a lot of cultural issues, social issues. The economy came up, of course, but Mahoning Valley, that's the bread and butter of this campaign. The last 20 years, it represents Ohio's declining manufacturing economy.
Yeah, well, we really have two components of the economy, and of course Republicans should be talking about inflation, and the Democrats should be talking a lot more about jobs. And actually here in Ohio, the traditional form of the economy, when we talked about it, was always jobs. Jobs, 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 going way back to Jim Rhodes or whatever. And I was surprised also that neither candidate was doing enough to, I understand why Ryan would not want to talk about the economy defined as inflation, but in fact, the part of the economy that deals with employment, those numbers are spectacular. But always fighting, he says, to keep jobs from going to China. Okay, that's fine. That really reflects the Youngstown area and all of that. But I was surprised too. And of course, the Republicans at one point were saying nationally, damn it, just talk about inflation. Don't talk about abortion. Don't talk about anything else. So it was a little surprising. But I think these candidates don't like each other. And I think probably Ryan understands that the only chance he has to win is if, in fact, he can successfully portray J.D. Vance as inauthentic and an extremist.
Tim kept calling him buddy and pal, so we must like J.D. Buddy, pal.
It's a very urban colloquial.
I was waiting for partner.
Brother.
Yeah, brother. That was another good one.
You know, Tim Ryan, Andrew, has been going for the white working class male through his campaign. He's been trying to recapture those folks that have gone to Trump. The Signal poll shows that J.D. Vance leads among men without a college degree 58% to 34%. That's a 24-point lead. Doesn't look like that's working, at least not working well enough.
That's actually somewhat better than Trump did. So that's actually not a terrible number if you're a Democrat. But I think that with the things that you saw Tim Ryan speak about in that debate, which are January 6th, great replacement theory, as well as abortion, kind of speaks to sort of the elements of maybe the more gettable parts of the coalition that he's trying to build. And so I think that's a fragile coalition that includes kind of moderate Republicans who might not be inclined to vote for Democratic policy broadly. So, but like I said, the focus that he had on that, I think, speaks to who he's really trying to get to vote for him and stitch a victory together.
Jesse, fundraising's a problem. Both candidates have plenty of money, but Tim Ryan has not gotten much national money compared to J.D. Vance, which has got a lot of national money, and he doesn't have a whole lot of money he's raised on his own. So it's kind of a tale of two campaigns there.
Yeah, I mean, that's been the focus of a lot of the discussion over the past week or so, has been whether national Democrats are really going to invest in this race. Now, certainly they put millions of dollars into it, but not nearly as much as J.D. Vance is getting help from the Senate Republicans, but also Peter Thiel, his kind of benefactor from the beginning of the race.
Andrew, you saw Ted Cruz Friday campaigning for J.D. Vance, national folks coming in. Does that really have an impact on the race?
I was really struck by the enthusiasm by the crowd that saw Cruz, and I was in Medina to see that. I'm not as sure about things like Tim Scott and Tom Cotton were in Columbus on Thursday. I don't know if that really gets people to vote exactly, but I think that, it generates social media attention. I imagine there's fundraising happening on the side and stuff like that. So it is interesting, and and more than anything, I view it as these candidates trying to build their national profile and build something in the future.
Joe Manchin's coming in, Amy Klobuchar is coming in, Lindsey Graham, if he ever decides to run for president again.
Yeah, this is a lot about building partnerships and alliances with other national politicians. And also the campaigns gather data from people waiting in line to get into the rally, and that helps to turn out the vote effort.
Herb?
Well, one of Ryan's hopes is that he can win a higher share of the Republican vote than a Democrat can typically win. And the only way he can really do that is to really, in a sense, have J.D. Vance seen as too much of a Trumpster, too extreme and all of that. So in some ways, these candidates coming in really help bring the base together. But I think a lot of Republicans in Franklin County who are saying, oh, he's endorsed by Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton, that doesn't sell with them. And so one of the things I'd be interested in some of the polls is what percentage of the Republican vote is Ryan getting? What percentage of the Democratic vote is Vance getting?
Yeah. All right, let's get to our next topic. Governor Mike DeWine's strategy in this campaign is to avoid the debate stage, and that strategy seems to be working. The two polls out this week show DeWine with a nearly 20-point lead over his Democratic challenger, Nan Whaley. This week, the Columbus Metropolitan Club sponsored a discussion with the two candidates. DeWine did not show, leaving the stage to an empty chair and to Whaley, who touted her support for abortion rights.
And I've been very clear, too, that the first thing we would do once we're elected is work to put Roe in the Ohio Constitution so it will be codified and no extremists can take away a right that we had, that my mother fought for, that my niece doesn't have. This is the position of the majority of Ohioans. Over 60% of Ohioans want Roe versus Wade. And let me be clear for folks that don't understand the abortion discussion. Roe has limits. Those were the limits around viability that were the law of the land my entire life until this summer. That's what that's what Ohio women deserve. That's what we would fight for, and that's what the majority of Ohioans believe.
Of course, Mike DeWine strongly opposes abortion rights. Herb Asher, you were at the Metropolitan Club with me on Wednesday, as was Jesse. Two things I noticed. Nan Whaley has really sharpened her message.
Yes.
And there were only 60 people in the room.
Yep.
Many more people watching online, but only 60 people in the room.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have realized that Nan Whaley is not going to win. There's probably nothing in the world that could change the dynamics right now. I think when Nan Whaley ran initially, she was hoping for a corruption issue really having legs and hoping for more indictments. So I think a lot of people said this race is over. But I think you're right, Mike. She actually, I heard her earlier in the campaign and heard her this past Wednesday. She has become a much better candidate.
Jesse Balmert, she's leaning into the abortion issue now, where before it was one of many. Now it seems to be that's where she is focusing. That's where her ads are lately. That it was a moderated discussion here, but she was championing her rights on that, her views on that.
Yeah, so nearly all of her ads are focused on this issue. She is leaning in to a particular case that happened out of Columbus, where a 10-year-old obtained an abortion in Indiana, a victim of sexual assault. The accuser, or the defendant in that case, was later charged. That is an issue that all Democrats are leaning into, but certainly Nan Whaley is in her ads as well. The question is whether this is an issue that's going to have broad support from voters enough to unseat an incumbent with a fundraising and name recognition advantage. And that's just not likely at this point.
Hey, when someone is drowning, we throw them a life ring, and she is metaphorically, politically drowning, and this life ring is a lead life ring. It will do her no good. She has lost the thread. The thread is what affects people every day, and she's talking about something that affects a very small amount of people.
But, well, half the population is women. Not all support abortion rights.
Looking for abortions.
But it's really gained in importance. I think it's like up to close to 19% say it's the most important in the election. So it's definitely different than it has been in cycles past.
But those are hard D voters. Anybody who was angry about Dobbs already knew where they were in the partisan spectrum before Dobbs was handed down. So the only argument they can make is we'll turn out more of them, but to turn out somebody on anger, they've got to be angry every single day. What makes you angry every single day? Groceries, gas, understaffed restaurants, not being able to get parts for your car. That's what will drive turnout.
Andrew, Governor DeWine is laser focused on jobs. That's the subject of his ads with Lieutenant Governor Husted. So he's focused on jobs, but inflation's high, and he's governor. It's odd how Tim Ryan gets blamed for inflation, but Mike DeWine does not. And Mike DeWine can say, look at the jobs, and Tim Ryan doesn't really pay attention to the jobs.
Yeah, I don't really know what to make of that. When you look at polling, generally the question, do you think Ohio's on the right track, does pretty well. Ohio is, of course, part of the United States, so these national issues do affect us here. It reminds me a little bit in 2012 when Mitt Romney was trying to say how bad things were in Ohio at the same time that John Kasich was, touting how great they were. So I don't really know why voters tend to assign blame to one person and, alleviate the next. Although I guess, the federal government has more influence on policy economically and stuff like that. But I just don't really know how voters view that.
That was the Kasich-Obama recovery.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, this is one of Tim Ryan's problems. Tim Ryan has to convince voters that for the last 20 years, he's just done a wonderful job, and we're in a wrong track environment. So like my favorite political philosopher, Marx, Groucho, used to say, who are you going to believe? Me or your own lying eyes?
No, Mike DeWine's been here for 40 years, and if we're on the same track, there's not two different tracks here.
Right, but he's a much more durable brand than Tim Ryan. Tim Ryan was a Mahoning Valley phenomenon with very little statewide note. DeWine is the most durable brand in Ohio politics since Jim Rhodes.
All right, it appears Ohio voters are enthused by this election. Early voting began about a week and a half ago, and so far more people are voting early than voted early 4 years ago when more races were more competitive. Overall, early and absentee voting is up about 3%. The pace of early in-person voting is up 74%. Mail-in ballot requests are about flat, maybe even a little down. Mark Weaver, can we read anything into this? 10 days in, enthusiasm seems to be there here and in other states as well.
Yeah, I think Tobias has a story coming out on this. Everyone should read it. There are some microtrends that suggest Republicans are more energized. Of course, we see that in a lot of places. But let's also remember, we've only been absentee voting in Ohio for a little more than a decade. Every cycle, it gets more popular as people figure out how easy it is to do. But there is a subset of Republicans who have heard that there's something hinky about early voting. Whether that's true or not is not important. If they think it, they won't do it. And that may be a drag on some of the Republican areas not early voting.
Are Democrats buoyed by the early in-person voting numbers being pretty good?
Yeah, I think they are. But again, I think we're trying to read too much into something that just may not be there. But I think the early in-person typically is helpful to Democrats, so that number is very, very high. But you know, those may be votes that they would have gotten now or later, but it's not necessarily an expansion of the pool of votes they're going to get.
Well, when you compare, Andrew, 2018, the last time we had a governor's race on the ballot, and this one, enthusiasm is better now.
Yeah, so what I'm seeing, if you actually look at the counties, the early vote requests are down around 9 or 10% in both Franklin County and Cuyahoga County. And so the Ohio geographic political map is complicated, but if you're a Democrat, you need to do well in the 3 Cs if you're going to do anything. And I think that's a problem. If you look at 2018, early voting was up 50% compared to 2014, and that roughly tracked with higher turnout in the county. So there are problems, there are questions about whether you're cannibalizing your election day vote. We don't necessarily know within the county. It's harder to tell who's actually requesting the ballots. Democrats, there's a sizable portion of African Americans who like the souls to the polls where they get churches basically organized and go vote on Sunday. So there's things like that make it a complicated story. But broadly, I think I'd rather, if I were Republican, seeing voting down or vote requests down 10% in Cuyahoga and Franklin County, I'd be happy with that.
Yeah, and like working from home, we've all gotten used to a different way of life. And in 2020, of course, we all voted early. Many of us voted early because of COVID. Maybe people just have fallen into a new habit. Jesse, getting back to the issues that are driving people to the polls. Economy is number one. It always is number one. But there are other issues here. Threats to democracy wasn't even really listed as a motivator back before 2021. And abortion is on the ballot. Different issue now because of the Dobbs decision.
Yeah, threats to democracy is such an enigma to me because it really means something different depending on your political persuasion. So maybe threats to democracy is, the January 6th Capitol riots. Maybe it's redistricting going not the way that you thought it should have been run. Maybe it is voting or concerns about voting. So it's a fascinating topic that is raised so much on the list of issues that we're talking about, but it's very hard to nail down what that actually means.
Yeah, it would be interesting if the pollsters would follow up and ask Republicans who have said threats to democracy is an issue, what do you mean by that? And if they mean by that elections are stolen, then that's part of it.
Many of them would say the politicization of federal law enforcement and a partisan attorney general pursuing the president's enemies using law enforcement.
It would be interesting to know what they're saying there, or are they saying, no, we think things are going a little too far, that the big lie is really a threat to democracy.
I don't think you'll get a lot of that from the right. I think what you'll hear is...
not necessarily the right. I mean, there are Republicans who are not on the far right.
Sure.
And so for those Republicans who wind up saying that threats to democracy, I'm just saying, we're each imputing certain kinds of meaning that people are assigning to this. But I wish the pollsters would ask, well, what do you mean when you say threats to democracy? Yeah. Are you talking about the big lie, or are you talking about the politicization?
Yeah, or the lie in 2016 that Trump stole the election with the help of the Russians, which of course was ridiculous, and a third of the Democrats have said it.
It's not doing the talking point. I mean,
no, but this is
right
true.
Now,
so people have different views of it. I'm agreeing with you that it's undefined.
Yeah,
and people, it's a little bit of, like Jesse said, it's an ink blot.
Yeah. The difference between 2016 and 2020 is Hillary Clinton did not say the election was stolen.
She sure did. Yeah, she implied very heavily that he was an illegitimate president, as did most of the Democrat Party leaders.
You can't compare what Hillary Clinton. I know, but you can't factually compare Hillary
Anybody who says the election.
She said, "I congratulate Donald Trump on winning."
Of course she did. But then she did with Stacey Abrams ran around and implied that perhaps the Russians did this.
So when Donald Trump says, "Okay, he won," then we can compare it, right?
No, what I'm saying is saying anything that the Russians had anything to do with the outcome of 2016 is a flat out lie, as is that the election of 2020 was stolen. There was a whole lot of bias in the media in 2020, and Time Magazine did a pretty good expose of the behind the scenes private effort to defeat Donald Trump. But there's been plenty of Democrats who've claimed that somehow Donald Trump was illegitimate.
Okay, let's get to our last topic. COVID. COVID is still here. The spread is low. The latest booster shot seems to be working very well, but the virus is still here, and doctors warn new variants could arrive in Ohio soon. You know what else is still here? COVID money, lots of it. The Columbus Dispatch reports 2 years after the start of the pandemic and the flood of federal assistance, Ohio still has $10 billion left. That's a little less than half of the $26 billion the state received. Ohio spent a lot of it on COVID health programs, child care assistance, and education. But some money repaid unemployment benefits, the loan the state had. Some money went to police, and some money helped pay for a water plant for the Intel project. Jesse Balmert, you know, COVID, most of the state's COVID-related expenses are gone now. And if you watch Governor DeWine and John Huston's ad, the economy is doing very well. Is there any talk at the State House of giving that $10 billion back?
You know, I think they're going to find a way to spend it. This isn't the era of John Kasich returning the money for the rail. So this is money that Republicans might not have voted for, or might have even said, like, this is not something we should be doing with our economy, but they're finding ways to spend it. And in fact, in, Governor Mike DeWine's case, he's going around the state and handing out checks to various law enforcement agencies with this money. And so it's interesting how much of it we have left. I thought the most interesting thing we've spent on this so far was basically paying the feds back for unemployment compensation, the loan that we asked for their money, and then we gave their money back to them. So, that was innovative.
Is there any talk of how to do this for the next pandemic, Andrew? How to do this differently? Have better ties to the money. Okay, you cannot spend it on water plants. You've got to spend it on things that are directly related to the national emergency that it was intended for.
I mean, that assumes that people are planning ahead in federal government as opposed to reacting to things. So I just can't imagine. But people discuss this on the front end. They realize that states would do all kinds of things with it, and they specifically said they could not cut taxes, although I believe that actually was successfully struck down in court. I'm not sure. I'm just kind of going off the cuff on that one. But there were some restrictions, including like pension funds too. But I think they understood that states would have broad flexibility to spend what they wanted. I think there's a federalism argument for that, and there's also sort of an efficiency argument. But of course, we have all this money left over, and there's a stat in that number that I like because the billions are easy to lose. It was something like the amount of money that Ohio received was equivalent to almost $11,000 per Ohioan, which is just so much money. If you could imagine the government writing you an $11,000 check, what would that do for somebody's, an average household? So, but yeah, it's striking to me that they're still trying to figure out what to do with this.
The feds poured a ton of money into all the states, and part of it was to make sure that the American economy just didn't totally collapse.
Yep.
And then there was other pieces of legislation that also sent a lot of money in. So that's one of the reasons why we have such inflation right now. Not the only reason, but the feds actually preserve the economy and preserve jobs. And so there's an interesting thing here, and we've seen this in so many instances. Money that Republicans voted against, where there was legislation. This is awful. We vote against this. And then you have money from those same dollars that are being spent to do groundbreakings or...
Well, it's possible to be against a tax policy and still take a deduction for your home interest mortgage if it's allowed, right?
Look, is this money well spent? Should there...
No.
Because there was... People warned that there were no rules for this at the time.
Throwing money at a problem almost never solves a problem.
Well, it kept the economy going.
Well, but now we're seeing the retraction, and now we're seeing inflation, and people are going to pay more on their home mortgages, and this is going to have decades of repercussions for most families.
If there weren't such hypocrisy, they would return the money to the federal government. It's a very simple solution. And figure out how much money there is in the 50 states that have not been spent, and say, well, if it's COVID money and the COVID issue is sort of, taken care of, let's give the money back. But, they're not going to give the money back.
And not just Ohio, any state.
Any state. And why won't they? Because they know that spending money and having groundbreakings and handing out checks and all that, in an election year especially, is a good thing.
A lot of this money, Andrew, was stolen. Fraud was off the charts. Unemployment fraud. And how do we get that money back? Because they've sort of just given up on that. There's so much of it.
And that's a major problem. There's no easy answer to that. But we saw in Ohio that the unemployment system was extremely antiquated. I mean, my wife had, her an unemployment claim filed in her name. Like, there are a lot of other people in my life like that. And so I just, I'm not sure what the solution is because I'm not in charge of that, but clearly it was a problem.
All right, let's get to our off-the-record parting shots. Mark Reeve, you're up first.
We're talking about polls earlier. I had a piece in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago that's worth looking at it because it finds that there are some people, Trump voters, who will not talk to pollsters. We call these submerged voters. So all of these polls you're reading are underrepresenting the Trump base by 4 or 5 points, which changes the top line probably to the right at least a few points.
All right, Herb Asher.
Well, I think the big lie about election fraud and how bad our political system is beginning to bother more and more people in terms of the long-range consequences of that. And I think we're going to see various groups say, let's adopt a policy with our company or our labor union or a private group, whatever. Don't endorse candidates who endorse the big lie.
All right, we'll see. Andrew.
I guess I'll go with the Cleveland Guardians. Had a really nice season, and they fell short. But I feel like they achieved expectations, and I'm happy with that. And now I'm excited that Cleveland Cavaliers have started their season. I have high hopes there.
Browns? No.
I didn't mention them.
Okay. And Jesse.
Staying in the Cleveland area, the Ohio Supreme Court this week suspended a judge for running her courtroom like a game show.
Yes, she had all kinds of knickknacks on the.
And she wore a basketball uniform on the bench.
There you go.
All right. If you want to learn more about this election and the people who are running, the issues on the ballot, check out the WOSU voter guide. It's at our website, WOSU.org. It's a great resource. That is Columbus on the Record for this week. Continue the conversation on Facebook. We'll put Mark's article on our Facebook page, Columbus on the Record Facebook page. And you can watch us on demand anytime at our website, WOSU.org/COTR, and on the PBS video app. For our crew and for our panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.